The wind rolled slowly across the Wyoming prairie, bending the tall grass into waves of gold that shimmered under the late summer sun. From the porch of the small wooden house, Daniel Mercer leaned against the railing and watched the horizon as if expecting it to speak back to him. It had been 3 years since anyone had called this place lively, 3 years since laughter had filled the rooms, 3 years since he had buried his brother. Now the ranch was his alone. 200 acres of stubborn land, a barn that needed fixing, and a house that echoed too loudly at night. Daniel was a quiet man by nature, broad-shouldered and strong from years of work, but loneliness had begun to settle into him like dust in the rafters. It was the town doctor who finally said it. "You need help, Daniel, not just hired hands, someone who'll stay." Daniel had shrugged at the time, but the words stayed with him. That was how the advertisement happened, a small notice placed in a Chicago newspaper. Widower rancher seeks practical woman for marriage of convenience. Home provided, respect guaranteed, no expectations beyond partnership and shared work. Daniel had written the words carefully. Honest words, plain words. He never expected anyone to answer, but someone did. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She arrived on a gray autumn morning, stepping down from the stagecoach with a small suitcase and a calm expression that surprised Daniel immediately. She wasn't timid like he had expected, nor desperate. She simply looked determined. Clara adjusted the brim of her hat and scanned the dusty street until her eyes landed on him. "You must be Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. Daniel nodded once. "Daniel." She offered a small, polite smile. "Clara." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, the noise of horses and wagon wheels filling the silence between them. Finally Daniel cleared his throat. "You understand the arrangement." "I do. No romance, no pressure, just a partnership." Clara studied his face carefully, as though weighing something deeper than his words. "That's exactly what I'm looking for," she replied. Daniel nodded again. "Well then." And just like that, the most important decision of their lives was made in the middle of a dusty street, with barely a dozen words exchanged. They married that afternoon in the town church. The preacher looked puzzled. The townsfolk looked curious. But neither Daniel nor Clara seemed troubled. It was simple, practical, temporary, perhaps. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the wagon creaking over the long dirt road. Clara watched the land stretching endlessly around them. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Daniel followed her gaze. "Most people say it's empty." Clara smiled faintly. Empty places can still be full of peace. That night, Clara unpacked her small suitcase in the spare bedroom. Daniel had already prepared it carefully, fresh sheets, a wash basin, and a small lamp. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. "If anything's missing, I can get it in town." Clara shook her head. "You've done more than enough." They looked at each other for a moment. Two strangers who had just promised to share a life. "Good night, Clara," Daniel said. "Good night, Daniel." And so began their marriage of convenience. The first weeks passed quietly. Clara woke early each morning and began organizing the house with gentle efficiency. She repaired curtains, scrubbed floors, and filled the kitchen with the smell of warm bread. Daniel worked the fields and the cattle as he always had. But now, when he returned home each evening, a lantern glowed in the window. It was a small thing, but it changed something inside him. They spoke little at first, mostly practical matters. Supplies, weather, livestock, yet slowly, small conversations began to stretch longer. One evening Clara asked, why, Wyoming?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "My brother and I came west 10 years ago. Land was cheap." "And your brother?" Daniel stared at the table. "Fever." Clara nodded softly. She didn't ask more, but her silence felt like understanding. Over time, Daniel noticed things about her. The way she hummed quietly while cooking. The way she read books by lantern light late into the night. The way she never complained about the endless wind. Clara noticed things too. Daniel always fixed broken things before anyone asked. He brought fresh water inside every morning before she woke, and he never once entered her room without knocking. It was a careful kindness. Neither of them spoke about it. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the fields and trapped them inside the house for long evenings. One night the wind roared so fiercely it rattled the windows. Clara sat near the fireplace reading while Daniel repaired a saddle. The storm outside seemed endless. Finally Clara said softly, "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked up. "Of course. Why did you really place the advertisement?" Daniel hesitated. The fire cracked in the silence. "Because I was tired of eating dinner alone." Clara lowered her book. "I understand that." She didn't say anything else. But the look they shared across the room held more warmth than either of them expected. Days turned into months. Their routine became comfortable, easy. They laughed occasionally now, shared meals, walked the fields together on quiet afternoons. Sometimes Clara rode with Daniel when he checked the fences. One afternoon her horse stumbled near a shallow creek. Daniel caught her before she could fall. For a brief moment she was in his arms, her breath close, her eyes wide. Neither moved. Then Clara stepped back gently. "Thank you." Daniel nodded quickly, but something had shifted. Something neither of them acknowledged. Spring arrived with melting snow and green shoots across the prairie. The ranch was alive again. Clara planted a small garden beside the house. Daniel watched her kneeling in the soil one morning. "You didn't have to do that." Clara wiped dirt from her hands. "I wanted to." He looked at the neat rows she had planted. "You plan on staying a while." Clara looked up at him. "I thought that was the arrangement." Daniel felt oddly relieved. That summer the ranch prospered, more cattle, better harvest. The house felt brighter. Sometimes when townsfolk visited, they assumed Daniel and Clara were a normal married couple. They never corrected them, and slowly, something unexpected began to grow between them. Not quickly, not dramatically, just quietly, like roots beneath the soil. One evening in late August, Daniel returned from town with supplies. Clara was sitting on the porch watching the sunset. He sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. Finally, Clara said softly, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "Our arrangement." Daniel thought about it carefully. "No." Clara looked relieved. "Neither do I." The sky burned orange and gold across the horizon. Daniel glanced at her. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara considered the question. "Sometimes." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. "But not anymore," she added gently. The wind moved through the tall grass again. The same wind that had once carried only loneliness now carried something warmer, something hopeful. Months later a storm hit the ranch harder than any before. Lightning struck the barn. Daniel rushed into the rain trying to save the animals. Clara followed without hesitation. Together they worked through the night. Soaked, exhausted, terrified, when the danger finally passed, they stood in the rain beside the smoking barn. Daniel looked at her. "You could have stayed inside." Clara shook her head. "This is my home too." The words hung in the air. Daniel suddenly realized something he had been avoiding for months. This was no longer an arrangement. This was a life, a real one. He stepped closer. "Clara," she looked up at him. "What is it?" Daniel struggled for words. "I think somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of this as temporary." Clara's heart raced. So did I. The rain slowed around them. Daniel hesitated only a moment before reaching for her hand. Clara didn't pull away. In fact, she stepped closer. For two people who had once promised never to expect love, The feeling now was undeniable. Daniel spoke softly. "We said this would only be a marriage of convenience." Clara smiled. "I remember. And we agreed not to fall in love." Clara laughed quietly. "Yes, we did." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "Looks like we failed." Clara looked into his eyes, warmth shining there. "No," she said softly. "I think we succeeded." And beneath the clearing storm, on a quiet Wyoming ranch that had once felt empty and lonely, two people who had planned only for practicality finally allowed themselves something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. They allowed themselves love.